Hi, I'm Jesse Miles, and I want to teach you personal finance. I have a master's in international business from the Swiss School of Business and Management in Geneva, Switzerland. I've owned and operated multiple businesses, and now I teach business and personal finance for a living. I believe it's crucial for young people to understand saving, investing, debt, credit cards, loans, real estate, taxes, digital currency, digital finance, and other aspects of personal finance in order to fund their own great adventure and live life their way. In this video, I want to talk to you about inflation. Inflation is one of the foundational concepts that every young person needs to understand. You need to know how inflation is caused, the pressure that it puts us all under, what we can do about it, and how you can use inflation against big banks.
Go on an adventure, go on an adventure, go on.
Hi, I'm Jesse Miles, and I want to talk to you about inflation. Inflation is when the cost of goods and services is rising because the value of the currency is dropping. So where you notice it is in the cost of goods and services. When you go to the grocery store or when you try to get an oil change, you notice things are more expensive than they used to be. It seems like things are getting more expensive arbitrarily, like the person who makes the cheese is raising their prices, or the guy that does the oil change is raising his price. But that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is the value of the dollar is dropping. So why does the value of the dollar drop? The primary reason for inflation is money printing. If you increase the supply of something, you inherently decrease the value of that thing. For example, diamonds. Diamonds are valuable because they're scarce, because they're rare. Gold. Gold is valuable because it's rare. As you increase the supply of gold, it becomes less valuable. If we suddenly discovered a brand new gold mine in Utah and it was, significantly increased the global supply of gold, the value of gold would drop because there's more of it. And the same thing happens with the dollar. As the Federal Reserve prints more money, the value of the dollar drops because the supply of dollars is increasing. Most national currencies, like the US dollar, are inflationary. They become less valuable over time. In other words, you need more of them to buy the same amount of stuff. A really good example of this is Indonesia. I have money from Indonesia because I grew up there for 7 years, and I visited back and forth in my 20s quite a lot, and I just have a lot of extra money from Indonesia. So let's look at what happened in Indonesia. Here we have 1959, we have a 25 rupiah note. So this would have been an average currency at the time, 25 rupiah. Right? It's probably like a $1 bill, $2 bill, $5 bill. That was in 1959. By 1977, it's 500. 500 rupiah. Now this is the $5 bill. Okay, so in 20 years, it has gone from 25 rupiah to 500 rupiah. 20 years later, in 1999, 50,000 rupiah. Now this is the $5 bill, maybe the $10 bill. I was there in the 90s. I think this was more like a $10 bill. What you get with this is around the same as what you got in 1959 with a 25 rupiah note. So somehow Indonesia got from 25 rupiah in 1959 to purchase, we'll say, 2 meals, to suddenly 50,000 rupiah in the 90s to purchase 2, maybe 3 or 4 meals. So currently in the US, we have, according to the Federal Reserve, about a 5% inflation. That's what their numbers, based off of what they measure. But if you walk through the grocery store, it doesn't feel like that. You look at prices from last year, or even, especially from 5 years ago, and things are looking like they've increased by a lot more than 5%. I think it is a lot higher than the Fed wants to acknowledge, and then on top of the inflation, companies are adding their own little bit. Yeah, maybe we have 10% inflation, and then companies are seeing that and going, well, consumers expect a price hike, so why don't we take it to 15%, and then we'll keep 5, and 10 will adjust for inflation. There is a silver lining. Inflation hurts the lender, not the borrower. So who gets hurt when you take out a loan and then money starts to become less valuable? Well, the lender does. So if you get a loan with Bank of America at 2% interest, and then inflation is at 10% interest for the next 5 years, well, Bank of America is losing 8% a year, and you're not. They are. Inflation hurts the lender, not the borrower. If you can get a loan at a lower interest rate than inflation is expected to be for the next few years, you're winning. They're losing. Banks are getting hurt, not you. So think about that. You don't want to get a 19% loan when inflation is 5%. You're still losing 14% a year. But if you can get the money now while it's more valuable and then pay it off as money loses value, as the dollar loses value, you're winning, they're losing. Think about it. $500 was worth more in 1950 than it is now. So when should you borrow $500? In 1950. And pay it off today when $500 is like pocket change. In $500 in 1950, you could have done something with that. Let's think about it as 20, 50 grand. Let's say 50 grand today, 50 grand in 1950. Well, get it in 1950 and buy a house. And then today pay off 50 grand with like a year or two of wages. If you live in Indonesia, borrow 50,000 rupiah in 1959 and then pay back 50,000 rupiah in 1999, 40 years later, when it's literally pocket change. So that's the bright side of inflation. That's the silver lining. But aside from that, it's pretty much bad news for consumers because everything is more expensive and wages do not necessarily rise with inflation. Poor people are hurt the worst. There are other ways that inflation is caused, but the relevant cause to discuss is the money printing, the increase of the supply of the currency, because that is what was done during the pandemic in nearly every Western country. The United States, Great Britain, Europe significantly increased the supply of their currency during the pandemic. So we will be living in the after effects of that for at least the rest of this decade. In the past, there have been countries such as Venezuela or the Weimar Republic that experienced such rapid inflation that they were no longer counting money, but they were weighing it. That's called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is just about the worst thing that could possibly happen to a population because the average person loses all their purchasing power very quickly. Currently in Turkey, they have about 50% inflation. In Argentina, it's even worse. And in these countries, people are struggling to maintain their purchasing power because they know next year, the amount of money I have will be worth less. I will have less money next year, even if I just hold it in my hand. If I hold this bill in my hand, next year it'll be worth less. I'll be able to buy less stuff with it next year. Same bill, I won't be able to buy a sandwich next year. I will be able to buy half a sandwich next year. And in those countries, people are doing crazy things to maintain their purchasing power. They're buying a bunch of motorcycles and keeping them in a garage, or buying gold, or buying Bitcoin, or buying, physical goods that will maintain their value. Because what happens with inflation is the price of everything goes up. So if you can turn your money into stuff, the value of that stuff theoretically will go up over time with inflation, right? So as the value of the currency drops, you need to not hold your currency as currency. You need to turn it into cars or houses or land that will also rise in price as inflation increases. So a lot of people are doing that recently. They're turning the money into land, gold, Bitcoin, physical property, things that will maintain their value over time. So now that we have a basic understanding of inflation, let's do a little bit of inflation math, okay? And let's think about this from the perspective of a corporation. Let's use Apple as our example. If Apple is selling the iPhone for $1,000 this year, and next year they need to make the same profit, but we have 10% inflation, what does Apple need to sell the iPhone for next year? So if we have 10% inflation, then the correct answer is $1,100. It's selling for $1,000 this year. Next year, with 10% inflation, they need to up their price to keep their profits consistent. So next year, they have to sell the iPhone for $1,100. If it's 10% again, if inflation is still at 10% the year after that, they need to sell it for $1,210. It's important to look at it from the perspective of a company needing to maintain consistent profits and having to up their price to maintain those profits, so that you can think as a consumer, okay, if I want to buy an iPhone next year and I have $1,000 now, but I know it's going to cost $1,100 next year, what do I do with my money to make it grow 10% by next year? Imagine in a country like Turkey, people are thinking 50%. Geez, I got to make 50% more money by next year. I got to invest my money in something that's going to grow 50% by next year. That's difficult. That's tough to do. I don't know how I would increase my money 50% by next year. That would be tough. But this is the situation you're put in when inflation is really high. The higher inflation gets, the more difficult choices you're forced to make with your cash, with your money, and also with your employment. Inflation really puts you in the hot seat. It's pressure, right? It's like being under a heat lamp, right? And it just gets hotter and hotter. The higher inflation gets, stress rises. And the higher inflation gets, the risk tolerance of people, especially investors, has to increase with inflation, because if you have to beat 10% inflation, you need to make at least 10% on your money. It needs to grow by 10%. So then people are looking at government bonds. Are bonds offering 10%? Probably not. Okay, well, I need to find a company, find an investment that's going to grow my cash 10% so I can still buy an iPhone next year. So that's my brief summary of inflation, how it affects you, how it affects the economy, how it affects the government, and what you can do about it, and what the silver lining of inflation is. So I'm going to keep making these videos about personal finance. I want to put together an entire playlist that has everything you need to know for personal finance. I teach business full-time, and I believe that providing people the tools for personal finance significantly improves their lives, especially young people. Teenagers and people in their early 20s, if they can learn saving, investing, debt, credit, loans, real estate, taxes, digital finance, and digital currency like cryptocurrency, if they can learn all of that, it will have a significant effect on their life. Their paychecks will not disappear as much as someone who does not understand those things. And when your paychecks don't disappear, your life improves. So I'm hoping to help people keep their paychecks and do wise things with those paychecks so that they can improve their life and pursue their own great adventure and live life their way.
Go on an adventure, go